Bienvenidos al canal de YouTube de Ediciones Radio. Aquí encontrarás vídeos especializados en cada tema. Si te gusta nuestro contenido, no olvides suscribirte, darle a me gusta y comentar tu experiencia. Gracias por elegirnos en tu camino hacia el éxito.
Recuerda que todos nuestros temarios también están disponibles en formato digital y papel. Para cualquier duda puedes escribirnos a info@edicionesradio.com. Cuerpo de Maestros. Inglés. Volumen 1.
Let thy speech be short, comprehending much in a few words. Introduction. This topic acquires a relevant importance, since it is directly related to the communicative approach, which maintains that learning a foreign language consists of understanding spoken messages, starting, maintaining and ending conversations, and reading, understanding and processing appropriate texts, in oral and written form. The main objective of the communicative approach is to help students produce messages in a meaningful way. This means that learning a foreign language is evaluated taking into account how the student develops their communicative competence, which could be defined as the student's ability to use its knowledge and communicate appropriately. According to the references of Curriculum on Communication, we must mention that, for example, through the Crown Decree 157/2022 of March 1, which establishes the organization and minimum teachings of primary education, in Annex 2, Foreign Language, it is highlighted that the area of foreign language in the primary education stage has as its main objective the acquisition of basic, communicative competence in the foreign language. In addition, in the same section of the mentioned Crown Decree 157/2022, the specific competencies for the foreign language area are developed. The specific competencies refer to the performance that students must be able to display in activities or in situations whose execution requires the basic knowledge of each area. We can highlight 6 specific competencies, all of them directly related to the communicative competence and connected to their respective descriptors of exit profile. They are the following. 1. To understand the general meaning and specific and predictable information of short and simple texts. 2. To produce simple texts in an understandable and structured way through the use of strategies. 3. To interact with other people using everyday expressions and resorting to various strategies. 4. To mediate in predictable situations, using strategies and knowledge to process and transmit basic and simple information in order to facilitate communication. 5. To recognize and use personal linguistic repertoires between different languages. 6. To appreciate and respect linguistic, cultural and artistic diversity. 1. Language as communication. 1.1. Linguistics theories. First of all, according to Saussure, we must distinguish between language, parole, and a language, lang. Language, parole, is an original code which is determined by the human being's linguistic faculties. A language, lang, on the other hand, is used to designate artificial codes like scientific languages and others. There are 2 more terms, natural and artificial language. Natural languages are native languages, like English, Spanish or German, whereas artificial language refers to languages created for a special purpose, such as traffic signs. Some linguists argue that artificial language and a language, lang, are the same. Linguistics as a science was initiated in 1916, with the Cause de linguistique générale by Saussure. This author tries to define the terms langue and parole. A sign is the basic unit of language, a given language at a given time. Every langue is a complete system of signs. Parole, the speech of an individual, is an external manifestation of langue. http://en.wikipedia.org. Saussure's work is considered a starting point of structuralism. While Saussure had great influence in Europe, Bloomfield developed his own version of structural linguistics in America. On the other hand, the Prague School of Linguistics, Roman Jakobson, was very influential, although their main concern was phonemics, the branch of linguistics which deals with the study of the phonemes of a language. Edward Sapir was another American anthropologist-linguist. Anthropology consists of the study of humankind, a leader in American structural linguistics, and one of the creators of what we now call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This hypothesis is based on the idea that language influences the ways people think. A different view on linguistics is given by Chomsky. His works on generative linguistics contributed to the decline of behaviorism and led to the advance of cognitive sciences. The theory of his original transformational grammar states that utterances, sequences of words, correspond to abstract surface structures, which in turn correspond to even more abstract deep structures. The creation and interpretation of utterances are governed by transformational rules, phrase structure rules, and structural principles. Every human being has an innate capability to structure her utterances. In general, his approach is motivated by the fact that children learn languages at an incredible pace. 1.2. Language as a communication tool. Linguists estimate that there are about 6,000 different languages spoken in the world today. The imprecision in this estimate is largely due to the fact that some dialects are in the process of diverging, and it is not clear that they have reached the stage of being separate languages. If two people find each other's speech unintelligible, they are usually thought to be speaking different languages rather than dialects. There are about 200 languages that have 1 million or more native speakers. Mandarin Chinese is the most common, English is third. http://dailynewsdig.com/ English is far more worldwide in its distribution than all other spoken languages. It is an official language in 52 countries, as well as many small colonies and territories. In addition, about the third part of the people in the world understand and speak English to some degree. It has become the most useful language to learn for international travel, and is now the de facto language of diplomacy. English is also the dominant language in electronic communication. About 75% of the world's mail, telexes and cables are in English. Approximately 60% of the world's radio programs are in English. About 90% of all internet traffic is as well. There are no primitive languages. All languages have a system of sounds, words, and sentences that can adequately communicate the content of culture. The languages of the so-called primitive peoples are often very complex in their grammatical structures. There seems to be no correlation between a language's grammatical complexity and the technological level of a society or other aspects of culture. Every language can create new words to describe new situations and objects. Therefore, it is not surprising that all languages change through time. None is static. However, They change at different rates at different times in response to new social, cultural, and environmental conditions. Many animal and even plant species communicate with each other. Humans are not unique in this capability. However, human language is unique in being a symbolic communication system that is learned instead of biologically inherited. Symbols are sounds or things which have meaning given to them by the users. The meaning is arbitrarily assigned. A word is one or more sounds that in combination have a specific meaning assigned by a language. A major advantage of human language being a learned symbolic communication system is that it is infinitely flexible. Meanings can be changed and new symbols created. Language and speech are not the same. Speech is a broad term, simply referring to patterned verbal behavior. In contrast, a language is a set of rules for producing speech. A dialect is a variant of a language. If it is associated with a geographically isolated speech community, it is referred to as a regional dialect. However, if it is spoken by a speech community that is merely socially isolated, it is called a social dialect. Over the last few centuries, deaf people have developed sign languages that are complex, visual gestural forms of communicating with each other. Since they are effective communication systems with standardized rules, they also must be considered languages in their own right, even though they are not spoken. A pidgin is a simplified, improvised language that develops to fulfill the communication needs of people who have no language in common, but who need to occasionally interact for commercial and other reasons. Pidgins combine a limited amount of the vocabulary and grammar of the different languages. People who use pidgin languages also speak their own native language. At times, a pidgin language becomes the mother tongue of a population. When that happens, it is called a Creole language. In general, oral and written language may be used by humans to communicate. 2. Oral language. Traditionally, from the educative point of view, oral language was considered less important than written language, because oral language would be acquired automatically by the child. It is not until 1970 that new pedagogic orientations give priority to oral language, with the aim to speak well and to be able to listen comprehensibly. So, the child's linguistic competence at the moment of schooling will be the basis for progressive perfection of oral expression. This is why the Organic Law 3/2020 BO of the 29th of December 2020, henceforth LOMLOE, amending the Organic Law of Education 2006, in its preamble, also underlines the importance of oral expression. There are a lot of reasons for the importance of oral language. Human language is mainly oral. From the historic point of view, written language is secondary. A child learns to speak before it is sent to school, only then it acquires written language. Within human language, oral language is the daily, vital and permanent means of communication. Great part of human communication is oral. Therefore, oral language has taken root in all statements of effective, social, and intellectual human life. The command of oral language is fundamental for the later acquisition of written language. Mistakes in oral communication, poverty of vocabulary, syntactic mistakes or bad articulation will influence written expression. 2.1. Characteristics of oral language. It is more complex to teach oral language than to teach written language, as we have to add the special difficulties of the oral code to the general ones. Thus, we need a specific methodology and treatment. In oral language, we have to treat phonic and prosodic features of speech, rhythm and intonation, which depend on a complex system of phonation and hearing. The application of written language allows us to plan and organize the communicative act, to take care of different aspects, and to correct the final result. Oral language is produced quickly and automatically, thus the learning process for its application is more complicated. Oral communication is more complex because the interlocutor is directly present, and by listening, accepting, denying, sharing or disagreeing, he has direct influence on the other interlocutor. Thus, oral communication will always be more subjective, as it is full of affective interferences which depend on the speaker and the listener. The efficiency of communication will depend mainly on the transmitter's and receiver's self-confidence and personality, as well as affective features like friendliness, respect or aggressiveness. 2.2. Aspects and development of oral language. According to Linfers, oral language is a complex system that relates sounds to meanings and is made up of three components: the phonological, the semantic, and the syntactic one. The phonological component involves the rules for combining sounds. Speakers of English, for example, know that an English word can end, but not begin with an ng sound. Native speakers are not aware of these rules, but their ability to understand and pronounce English words demonstrates that they do know an enormous number of rules. The semantic component is made up of morphemes, the smallest units of meaning that may be combined with each other to make up words, e.g. book plus s are the two morphemes that make up books and sentences. A dictionary contains the semantic component of a language, but also dictates which words and meanings are important for the speakers of a language. The syntactic component consists of the rules that enable people to combine morphemes into sentences. As soon as a child uses two morphemes together, like in like sweets, it is using a syntactic rule about how to combine morphemes to express oneself meaningfully. Like all the rules for the production of language, syntactic rules become increasingly complex as the child improves speech. From combining two morphemes, the child goes on to combine words with suffixes or inflections, s or ing, e.g. books and playing, and eventually creates questions, statements, commands, etc. It also learns to combine two ideas into one complex sentence, like in I'll give you my ball if you give me sweets. In social situations, speakers of a language use these three components together. Some linguists might add a fourth component, pragmatics, which explains the rules of language use. Pragmatic rules are one part of a person's communicative competence, the ability to speak appropriately in different situations, e.g. informally at home or more formally at work. Young children need to learn the ways of speaking in the kindergarten or at school, where, for instance, teachers often ask rhetorical questions. Learning pragmatic rules is as important as learning the rules of the other components of language, as people are judged depending on what they say and when they say it. The development of oral language is one of the child's most natural and impressive accomplishments. Almost all children learn the rules of their language at an early age through use, and over time, without formal instruction. Human beings are born to speak. They have an innate gift for finding out the rules of the language used in their environment. The environment itself is also a significant factor. Children learn the specific variety of the language, dialect, that the people around them speak. Children do not, however, learn only by imitating the ones who are around them. We know that children work out proper linguistic rules because they use forms that adults never use, such as I seed mum or I see your tooths. Children learn the conventional forms, saw and teeth, as they find out the exceptions to the rules of English syntax. Like learning to walk, learning to talk requires time for development and practice in everyday situations. Constant correction of a child's speech is usually unproductive and demotivating. In conclusion, language occurs through an interaction among people, environment, and the children's own thinking abilities. It is difficult to state the exact moment when children develop these abilities. In general, children say their first words between 12 and 18 months of age. They begin to use complex sentences by the age of 4 to 4.5 years. By the time they start kindergarten, children know most of the basics of their language, so that they are able to communicate easily with someone who speaks as they do, uses their dialect. As with other aspects of development, you cannot predict language acquisition. One child may say its first word at 10 months, another at 20 months. One child may utter complex sentences at 5.5 years, another at 3 years. To develop linguistic abilities adequately, we need to apply linguistic and extra-linguistic resources. 2.2.1 Linguistic resources. Phonemic and orthoepic, correct pronunciation resources. They are only applicable to the oral code. Among them we find articulation of sounds, pause, accent, intonation, and rhythm. The aim of teaching any of these items will be the correct pronunciation of sounds, the adequate intonation according to the intention and meaning of the statement, and the emphasis the communicative act requires. Lexical, semantic, and morphosyntactic resources. In the same way as you have to know the rules of written language, you must know how to use the resources for oral communication correctly. Any speaker should be able to use rich and adequate vocabulary in each linguistic situation. Besides, the speaker should know how to join the communicative intention with the corresponding morphosyntactic constructions. At the same time, we must not forget those lexical and semantic characteristics which are proper of speaking. The student should know them and use them with correction, e.g., the usage of words of reinforcement, onomatopoeias, words that imitate the sounds of the objects they represent, the economy of syntactic elements, as well as frequent ellipsis or the usage of incomplete sentences, because things can be understood due to the given context without being mentioned. 2.2.2 Extralinguistic resources. When performing spoken language, the speaker not only uses the code of oral signs, but also a different one. Gestures and body language gain great significance when producing oral messages. Non-verbal communication is strongly related to verbal communication, as non-verbal cues substitute for, contradict, emphasize, or regulate verbal messages. For instance, if someone asks where the toilet is, you may simply point down the corridor. Someone's new haircut may be complimented, while your face shows the real feeling of dismay you have. And certainly, the flow of conversation is regulated non-verbally, for instance, by raising an index finger, nodding and leaning forward, raising eyebrows, and/or changing eye contact. That is one of the reasons for using dramatization in the learning-teaching process of oral language. 2.3 Methodology for teaching oral language. Keeping in mind that the final aim of teaching oral language is the pupil's fluent production of spoken language, First, they need to develop the ability of understanding. The students will not be able to understand spoken language if they do not have the chance to practice it in the classroom. Although listening is a receptive skill, it must be practiced. Poor understanding often makes the pupils feel nervous and inhibits their ability to speak. The Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR, recommends methodological approaches for different levels of foreign languages teaching in order to develop communicative competence in oral skills through the performance of tasks or activities. Following this statement, one of the methodologies to carry out is project-based learning, PBL. It is an active methodology that makes students protagonists of their own learning. It is a methodological strategy that implements a set of tasks based on the resolution of questions or problems through a research process by students who work with a high level of involvement and cooperation, and that ends with a final product. One of the most significant authors of project-based learning is Fernando Trujillo, who mentions that, in the linguistic areas, a higher proportion of flexible curricular elements related to know-how is observed. 2.3.1 Methodological Principles. Principle of activity. You learn to speak and listen well if you practice every day. Therefore, students must be motivated to practice oral expression and comprehension from the first levels on. Principle of socialization. Oral language is the main vehicle for establishing social relationships with other people from the community. Therefore, it is important to use group dynamic, which facilitates the students' interaction and the participation of all group members with the aim to increase communication. Principle of individualization. Linguistic and mental development is individual and different in each child. The teacher must find out each pupil's characteristics and deal with them specifically to favor his/her qualities and to correct mistakes. Motivation. The first aim at school should be to motivate and release oral language starting from the child's interest and experience, referential principle. To do so, it is necessary to create an adequate linguistic context and atmosphere. Thus, the pupils can discover, rehearse and consolidate the necessary resources to express their desires, feelings and experiences. The children must feel the need to communicate, and this is only possible starting from their own personal experience. In this way, language will be elaborated. On the other hand, to free language means to create the adequate atmosphere. To be able to speak, pupils must be listened to, talked to, and we must let them speak. 2.3.2 Main forms and techniques of oral communication. There are two big groups of techniques and activities to practice communication. Practice of dialogues, conversation, role-play, survey, interview, dramatization, brainstorming, etc. Practice of monologues, narration, explanation and oral description, reading dialogues aloud, etc. In the following, we are going to have a closer look at some of them. A conversation. In oral communication, the term conversation refers to the continuous exchange of the roles of speaker and listener. Free or spontaneous conversation. It is the most frequent form of spoken language, which refers to an informal and spontaneous exchange of opinions and ideas about a topic. Although it is considered the most motivating activity for students, it seems a bit difficult to accomplish with primary pupils in the foreign language. Discussion or polemic conversation. In this kind of conversation, different points of view are confronted. The participants are meant to come to an agreement. The pupil's behavior gains importance in this kind of activities, as the discussion should not be considered a fight to see who wins, but a preparation for living in democracy. The topics can be related to everyday situations at school or to topical issues. Due to the complexity of this task, it should be carried out in the last grade. B. Dramatization. This is a very complex form of dialogue, as it does not only include oral expression, but also gestures and body language. Apart from being very motivating, you practice expression, dialogue, verbal fluency, imagination, and creativity. C. Interview and survey. They are forms of dialogue that are directed towards the search for information. One interlocutor asks, and the other answers. The success of these activities depends on the kind of questions asked to obtain the desired information. When planning the activity, you should keep the pupils' ages and interests in mind. D. Exposition or explanation. While exposing, the interlocutor is trying to explain something to the listeners. In comparison with the dialogue, an exposition has to be well organized and show linguistic fluency so as to maintain the listener's attention. E. Telephone conversation. Maybe this is the form of oral communication which is nearest to the student's immediate interests and needs. To have a successful conversation on the phone, there are some points of view to be kept in mind. Firstly, we should be aware of the fact that in this case the basic instrument of transmission is the voice. It substitutes any gesture we could take advantage of in a face-to-face conversation. This voice may transmit feelings and impressions like sincerity, confidence, and enthusiasm. Therefore, it is important for the pupil to learn how to take care of the tone of voice, rhythm, and pronunciation. Above all, it is convenient to teach them to speak slowly so that the interlocutor will be able to decipher the message. In the classroom, you can use a DIY telephone so as to make the situation as real as possible, and the pupils really become aware of the fact that it is not so easy to understand your partner if you do not see him, her, or know exactly what the message is about. Secondly, the comprehension of the message is also influenced by the linguistic items used. These should be easy, presented in short sentences, and the linguistic and structural contents should be adapted to our pupils' knowledge. Another element to be included, step by step, is the attitude shown when telephoning. What we really want to achieve is that our students do not feel scared or shy when they have to use L2 on the phone. Their attitude ought to be positive, showing interest in what is communicated by the interlocutor, above all when information is asked for. The latter will be the most frequently used issue when applying and evaluating oral communication in primary education. 2.3.3 Assessment of oral language. Assessment consists in finding out whether the pupils have achieved the aims proposed or not. Thus, evaluation has to be continuous and formative. On the other hand, evaluation will be individual, keeping in mind each student's particular characteristics. The task of evaluating is a difficult one in any subject, but as far as oral language is concerned, it is even more complex. This is due to the fact that oral communication is not only influenced by the way of expressing, but also by the speaker's personality, intelligence, and emotions. Therefore, oral expression must be evaluated tactfully. Process of assessment. It includes 3 levels. Diagnostic of the difficulties and mistakes. To diagnose the mistakes which take place in oral communication correctly, it is absolutely necessary to register the message. This registration can take place by means of taking notes or recording. Correction. During the correction process, it is important for all students to participate. Each student will have to correct his/her intervention and the classmates. Therefore, all pupils must know the aims to be reached and the items to be evaluated. Planning of activities of reinforcement and extension. When programming these tasks, we should only include 1 or 2 aspects in each session until the pupils are aware of their mistakes and the correct usage of the item we wanted to reinforce is achieved. 3. Written language. According to structuralism, written language only is secondary when learning a foreign language. That is why methodology for teaching written language is not very much investigated. In many cases, it has even been reduced to the graphic transcription of the structures taught orally before. What structuralism does not consider is that written language has some specific characteristics which need special techniques to be taught and learnt. Although written and oral language use the same code, their functioning is based on quite different norms and rules. One of these characteristics could be that the interlocutor is not present when we write. Thus, the receiver and the transmitter do not have the same context. In conclusion, when we write, we use a kind of monologue which is characterized by lack of reaction on the receiver's side. This lack of feedback impedes us to change our discourse immediately if we notice that the interlocutor does not understand. That is why we reflect continuously about what we write and what our interlocutor's reaction might be. Another characteristic of written language is the lack of paralinguistic features like gestures or body language. It is difficult to substitute these elements, which are so expressive. The greatest part of other elements, like accent, rhythm and intonation, do not appear in written language either. They are only represented by punctuation signs, like question or exclamation mark. All these aspects may take us to the conclusion that written language is by far less expressive than oral language. Written language does not count on situational context either, so it is more difficult for the receiver to guess the semantic contents of determined words or expressions with spatial reference. It is therefore important to substitute the situational context we can find in oral language by linguistic context in written language. When we write, we should not only represent graphically the elements of oral language, because a lot of them do not have the same communicative value in written and oral language. Linguistic resources for written language are almost only segmental elements. It is important to learn to express differently if we want to manage written language. Due to the little time we spend on writing in real life, it is easy to understand that learning written expression is a difficult task which requires techniques and activities, even in one's mother tongue. In a foreign language, it is much more difficult to have command on written language. In the following, we are going to consider the organization of the linguistic material in written language. Whereas the natural unit of oral language is the sentence, in written language it is the paragraph. Although we use various sentences together in oral language too, their connection is often defective from the grammatical point of view. This phenomenon exists because improvisation is used by the interlocutors in oral communication. These deficiencies of oral language usually do not impede its understanding, as they are repaired by the abundance of expressive resources. There is no doubt that from the logical and structural point of view, written language is better organized as it allows continuous reflection and revision. To make written language more understandable, it is fundamental to use words and expressions that connect or relate one sentence with another, and acquire a certain command of lexical and grammatical resources which allow us the usage of a rich and varied style. All these considerations take us to the conclusion that the command on written language requires a fluency that goes further than the linguistic competence a person may possess when speaking a language. Thus, written language must be taught. 3.1. Methodology of written language. As well as in the native language, in the foreign language we must teach written expression after having taught oral language. That does not mean that pupils may not express themselves by writing until they manage oral language perfectly. We only want to state that any practice of written language has to part from a previous task. It is important, above all at elementary levels, that the practice of written language helps us reinforce what has been learnt orally before. Doing so, we must not forget to make the students practice vocabulary and structures which are characteristic for the written code. In the same way as we distinguish controlled, guided or directed, and free practice in oral language, we should distinguish them in written language. The difference between the three stages is determined by the level of free participation the student has when writing. 3.1.1. Controlled practice. Here the pupil mainly manages in the written code a certain amount of linguistic material he has learnt orally beforehand. Some of the possible techniques are: presentation of scrambled sentences in a text or dialogue for the students to order logically. Presentation of a written text to be written again, substituting some words or expressions that are given in a list at random order. Presentation of a written text which only represents what one interlocutor in a dialogue says. Presentation of short texts with alternative expressions to choose one. It is not necessary to mention that the techniques presented here lack of communicative functions. With these exercises, the students only organize a certain amount of linguistic material correctly. One of the ways of initiating pupils in the usage of written language is to make them write short letters or notes to other classmates to tell them to do something interesting. 3.1.2. Guided or directed practice. When we refer to guided production, we want the pupil to choose linguistic elements with the help of the teacher's orientations. Thus, the student will have to decide on the way of expressing ideas or contents the teacher or the textbook provide. With this kind of activities, we not only pretend to consolidate the learning of the elements which the pupils acquired orally, but we also want to show the pupils how to express by writing. Now it is necessary for the teacher to propose the pupil the necessary stimuli to express herself. To carry out guided production, we can use a reading or a listening exercise. Taking advantage of this model, the students are asked to write their own version of the text without copying structures from the model given. At the beginning, the teacher may offer the students some ideas they may use while writing. Maybe this kind of activity obliges them to use new linguistic structures. In this case, we could talk about the creation of language. Apart from the exercises which are thought to reinforce the language learnt, we should show our students how to communicate by writing. For this aim, we will first treat the letter or email as a means of communication. Our students should learn how to write a letter to a foreign friend, or even to any institution, to ask for information. Written communication lets us practice a great deal of functions, as for example apologizing, accepting an offer, denying a request, asking for information, etc. The functions are the same we use in oral language. Learning to write letters or emails offers the pupils a direct utility of applying the foreign language. When teaching pupils how to write letters or emails, we can use similar techniques as for teaching writing in general. Using a letter or an email as a model, we can show the students typical expressions as well as the distribution of the different elements, like addressee and sender, the date, and the initial and final greeting. It is important to attract the pupils' attention towards the different styles we can use, according to the kind of letter, formal or informal. Following the example given, the pupils will have to write a similar letter, exposing their own ideas. There are different possibilities to help students in this process. One of them is the presentation of the general content of a model letter for the students to write a similar one. Another one is to give them a letter with gaps they have to complete with words or expressions from their own choice. The teacher will vary the way of presentation according to the pupil's knowledge. Essay writing is, of course, another important point of view when considering written language. In primary education, we will only initiate our pupils in how to write a correct essay in the foreign language. As we mentioned before, the paragraph is the basic element of written language. Nevertheless, to write good essays, it is not enough to join one paragraph with another one, but you need to know how to link your ideas. Paragraphs must therefore have a logical connection and refer all to the same general topic. Although writing can be considered an expression of art, there are some techniques to direct the pupils in this process. The students have to complete gaps in a paragraph with sentences or expressions they find on their own. The pupils have to link some sentences logically. The pupils will use a series of pictures to express their ideas by writing a short essay. They may listen to a short description of an event or a situation and take down notes. Using a number of oral instructions, the students will have to write a short text. The activities we have explained are quite different. With the integrated use of the 4 linguistic skills, we reflect the use of language in everyday life. Summarizing, we can say that it does not seem valid to practice only one of the 4 skills on its own, but we must join at least 2 skills. 3.1.3 Free practice. At this stage, the students have the opportunity to write about a topic with minimal help from the teacher. The clearest form of free production is when the pupil has a topic and expresses his or her opinions about it. To do this, the most appropriate linguistic elements will be chosen. Maybe this task will be too difficult for our young students, who usually do not feel able to express themselves. It is therefore convenient to use preparatory exercises and activities to express ideas, which can be used later for free production. Among these activities, we want to mention 2. Read an article in a magazine or a newspaper. Talk orally about an interesting topic. From the beginning on, the students should get used to writing out a draft with their ideas so that the production itself will be easier for them. Pupils often feel little motivated to carry out written exercises as they do not see their immediate utility. It is thus important to highlight the communicative value of written language, and the topics treated and evaluated should be interesting for our pupils. 3.2. Assessment of written language. It is not always easy to evaluate written production, but there are some guidelines a teacher can follow when he wants to assess the student's written production. A good test should give us a reliable indication of our students' skills and ensure that they do not suffer because of a question which has not been thought over carefully. It must also be kept in mind how the pupils react to the test. Has the test caused anxiety in the students? Are the students familiar with the test activities in the exam? Other features of a good test are that there is a choice of exercises and that it is as interesting as possible. Different kinds of exercises will ensure that the students have to concentrate and minimize the tiredness and boredom they could feel during a repetitive test. Another important feature of a good test is that it is fixed at an appropriate level. You can only really find this out by giving the test and studying the results. Basically, if everyone gets above 90%, you know it is too easy, or if everyone gets less than 10%, it is obviously too difficult. We suggest the following procedure when making a test. 1. Decide what kind of test it is going to be, multiple choice, fill in gaps, etc. 2. Write a list of the linguistic items the test is going to cover. 3. Think about the length, layout and the format. The younger the pupils are, the shorter the test. 4. Find appropriate texts, sentences, etc. Do not use unknown vocabulary. 5. Evaluate the different sections according to importance, time spent, etc. 6. Write the questions, decide on the gaps, etc. 7. Write the instructions and examples. Remember that you should give an example for any exercise. 8. Decide on the marks. How many points will a student need to pass? 9. Make a key. This makes correction fast and easy. 10. After the test has been taken, analyze the results and decide what should be changed. 4. Comparison of oral and written language. 5. Factors that define a communicative situation: transmitter, receiver, functions, and context. 5.1. What is communication? Traditionally, it has been said that communication is the process of transfer of information in which an addressee transmits a message to an addressee. All living societies, including the human being, work thanks to communication. Beyond communication in a strict sense, we can find communicative phenomena like thermometers, cells, or the brain. To define a communicative situation, its elements, means, and functions must be analyzed. 5.2. Elements of communication. The essential elements of communication are the following. Code. It is an arbitrary, limited, and rather extensive mixture of signs and signals. These are combined by the sender and the receiver, following previously established rules. Channel, Jakobson, contact. It is the means by which the signs and signals are transmitted. The message goes through this channel, e.g., the air in a face-to-face conversation between speaker and listener, or the wire when talking on the phone. Addresser, also called sender, encoder, addresser, transmitter, or speaker in oral communication. It can be an instrument, an animal, or a person. The message will be codified, and the convenient signals will be chosen. Addressee, also called receiver or decoder, the person who decodifies or interprets the received message. Message, the contents or the information the addressor sends to the addressee. Context, the situation in which the addressor and the addressee are. It often allows us a correct interpretation of the message. 5.3. Means of communication. They refer to the way or form the addressor chooses to transmit the information to the addressee. There are a lot of different means, and they can even be used simultaneously. Human communication is mostly carried out by means of oral and written language. However, there are other codes which may be used, like shaking hands, tactic communication; traffic lights, visual communication; nod your head to greet someone, visual communication; sound the horn, acoustic communication. Even tears, laughter, mime or art can be means of communication. As far as the use of oral and written language is concerned, we can mainly distinguish these means: personal contact, telephone, email, letter. 5.4. Functions of the communicative act. First of all, we have to explain that function and functionality are not the same. Functionality is a term that refers to a mechanical process, mainly of computer systems, and is achieved when the right functions are installed in a system so that the user can accomplish the desired tasks. When referring to communication, we must talk about functions and not functionality. Many linguists have tried to establish functions of communicative acts. In the following, we are going to summarize the most relevant ideas in a chronological order. Bronislaw Malinowski, 1884–1942, who defended functionalism, established in 1923 three functions. 1. Cognition, relating information. 2. Expression, indicating mood. 3. Conation, exerting influence. Karl Bühler, 1879–1963, established in 1934 also three functions in his model. 1. Representation, Darstellung, of states of affair. 2. Expression, Ausdruck, of the sender's feelings. 3. Appeal, appel to the receiver. Roman Jakobson, 1896–1982, who belonged to the Prague School and promoted structuralism and functionality, elaborated six functions which are based as well on Malinowski's as on Bühler's model. 1. Referential, denotative, to convey messages or information. 2. Emotive, expressive, to express attitudes, feelings, and emotions. 3. Conative, to persuade and influence others through commands and entreaties. 4. Phatic, to establish and maintain social relations. 5. Metalingual, to clear up difficulties about intentions, words, and meanings. 6. Poetic, to indulge in language for its own sake. M.A.K. Halliday, 1925, considered three functions in 1970. 1. Ideational, to communicate ideas and to express the content of an utterance referring to people, places, actions, events, states, qualities, and circumstances. 2. Interpersonal, to establish and maintain social relations, to influence on people's behavior, to get things done, and to express the speaker's feeling, attitudes, and opinions. 3. Textual, discoursal, to create texts and to link ideas. James Britton published in 1972, 3 different functions. 1. Expressive function. To draft important ideas, the speaker and the topic have the same importance. 2. Transactional function. To convey information clearly to others, this is the language function which is usually used in schools. 3. Poetic function. To create art. In 1977, Desmond Morris described 3 functions or aspects of communication. 1. Expressive. How the sender expresses him/herself and the impression this makes on the receiver. 2. Relational. How the receiver regards the relation with the sender. 3. Appealing. How the content of the message is being transmitted by the sender, question, order, request, etc. In 1983, Brown and Yule talk about only 2 functions. 1. Transactional function. To convey context, to communicate knowledge, skill and information. 2. Interactional functional. To maintain social relationship and express personal attitudes and emotions. According to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CEFR, the purpose of learning any language should be to communicate. That means to move thoughts, impressions or information from one person to another. That is why this topic is mainly related to the key competencies, linguistic communication, and multilingual competence, which are reflected in the Crown Decree 157/2022 of March 1, Article 9. There are always at least 2 people in any communication. To communicate, one person, the addresser, must put something out, and another person, the addressee, must take something in. This is called output and input. Consequently, language consists of 4 skills, 2 for output, speaking and writing, and 2 for input, listening and reading. Thus, 2 skills are for spoken, oral or oral communication, and 2 for written communication. Learning to speak comes before learning to write. In fact, we learn to speak almost automatically. It is a natural process for most people, except for the deaf. Nevertheless, somebody must teach us to write. Speaking may be considered as the real language, and writing only as a representation of speaking. However, for centuries, writing had a higher status. One important difference between speaking and writing is that writing is usually more durable or permanent. When people speak, their words live for a few moments. When people write, their words may live for years or even centuries. Modern technologies such as sound recording, telephone, radio, television, fax or email have had or are having an important impact on both speaking and writing. To some degree, the divisions between speaking and writing are disappearing. Emails are often written in a much less formal way than it is usual in written communication. With voice recording, for example, it has for a long time been possible to speak to somebody who is not in the same place or time as you. Even though this is a one-way communication, we can speak or listen, but not interact. With the telephone, video conference, and radio telephone, however, it became possible for 2 people to carry on a conversation without being in the same place. Concluding, we may say that, as Spanish educational law underlines, it is important for our students to learn to communicate by using both means, the spoken and the written one. 1. Language as communication. 1.1. Linguistic theories. First of all, we must distinguish between language, parole, and a language, lang. Language, parole, is an original code which is determined by the human being's linguistic faculties. A language, lang, on the other hand, is used to designate artificial codes like scientific language and others. There are two more terms, natural and artificial language. Natural languages are native languages, like English, Spanish or German, whereas artificial language refers to languages created for a special purpose, such as traffic signs. Some linguists argue that artificial language and a language, lang, are the same. Linguistics as a science was initiated in 1916 with the Cours de linguistique générale by Saussure. This author tries to define the terms lang and parole. Edward Sapir was another American anthropologist linguist, a leader in American structural linguistics, and one of the creators of what we now call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. A different view on linguistics is given by Chomsky. His works on generative linguistics contributed to the decline of behaviorism and led to the advance of cognitive sciences. 1.2. Language as a communication tool. Many animal and even plant species communicate with each other. Humans are not unique in this capability. However, human language is unique in being a symbolic communication system that is learned instead of biologically inherited. Symbols are sounds or things which have meaning given to them by the users. The meaning is arbitrarily assigned. A word is one or more sounds that in combination have a specific meaning assigned by a language. A major advantage of human language being a learned symbolic communication system is that it is infinitely flexible. Meanings can be changed and new symbols created. 2. Oral language. A language is a system of oral signs and constitutes the main communicative link among human beings. The command of oral language is fundamental for the later acquisition of written language. Mistakes in oral communication, poverty of vocabulary, syntactic mistakes or bad articulation will influence written expression. 2.1. Characteristics of oral language. In oral language we have to treat phonic and prosodic, rhythm and intonation, features of speech, which depend on a complex system of phonation and hearing. Oral language is produced quickly and automatically, thus the learning process for its application is more complicated. 2.2. Aspects and development of oral language. The development of oral language is one of the child's most natural and impressive accomplishments. Almost all children learn the rules of their language at an early age through use, and over time, without formal instruction. In general, children say their first words between 12 and 18 months of age. They begin to use complex sentences by the age of 4 to 4.5 years. By the time they start kindergarten, children know most of the basics of their language, so that they are able to communicate easily with someone who speaks as they do. 2.2.1. Linguistic resources. Phonemic and orthoepic resources. Lexical, semantic and morphosyntactic resources. 2.2.2. Extralinguistic resources. When performing spoken language, the speaker not only uses the code of oral signs, but also a different one. Gestures and body language gain great significance when producing oral messages. 2.3. Methodology of oral language. 2.3.1. Methodological principles of oral language. Principle of activity. Principle of socialization. Principle of individualization. Motivation. The first aim at school should be to motivate and release oral language starting from the child's interest and experience, referential principle. The children must feel the need to communicate, and this is only possible starting from their own personal experience. 2.3.2 Main forms and techniques of oral communication. Practice of dialogues, conversation, role-play, survey, interview, dramatization, brainstorming, etc. Practice of monologues, narration, explanation and oral description, reading dialogues aloud, etc. 2.3.3 Assessment of oral language. The task of evaluating is a difficult one in any subject, but as far as oral language is concerned, it is even more complex. This is due to the fact that oral communication is not only influenced by the way of expressing, but also by the speaker's personality, intelligence, and emotions. Evaluation of oral language includes 3 levels. Diagnostic, of the difficulties and mistakes. Correction. Planning of activities of reinforcement and extension. 3. Written language. Although written and oral language use the same code, their functioning is based on quite different norms and rules. One of these characteristics could be that the interlocutor is not present when we write. Thus, the receiver and the transmitter do not have the same context. Another characteristic of written language is the lack of paralinguistic features like gestures or body language. Linguistic recourses for written language are almost only segmental elements. 3.1 Methodology of written language. In the same way as we distinguish controlled practice, guided or directed practice and free practice in oral language, we should distinguish them in written language. The difference between the 3 stages is the level of free participation the student has when writing. 3.2 Assessment of written language. A good test should give us a reliable indication of our students' skills and ensure that they do not suffer because of a question which has not been thought over carefully. A good test also must be valid. It must test what it is meant to test. 4. Factors that define a communicative situation: transmitter, receiver, functions, and context. 4.1 What is communication? Traditionally, it has been said that communication is the process of transfer of information in which an addresser transmits a message to an addressee. 4.2 Elements of communication. Code. An arbitrary, limited, and rather extensive mixture of signs and signals. These are combined by the sender and the receiver following previously established rules. Channel. The means by which the signs and signals are transmitted. The message goes through this channel, e.g. the air, in a face-to-face conversation between speaker and listener, or the wire when talking on the phone. Addresser. It can be an instrument, an animal, or a person. The message will be codified, and the convenient signals will be chosen. Addressee. The person who decodifies or interprets the received message. Message. The contents, or the information the addresser sends to the addressee. Context. The situation in which the addresser and the addressee are. It often allows us a correct interpretation of the message. 4.3 Means of communication. They refer to the way or form the addresser chooses to transmit the information to the addressee. As far as the use of oral and written language is concerned, we can mainly distinguish these means. personal contact, telephone, email, letter. 4.4 Functions of the Communicative Act. Bronislaw Malinowski, 1884–1942, who defended functionalism, established in 1923 three functions. 1. Cognition, relating information. 2. Expression, indicating mood. 3. Conation, exerting influence. Karl Bühler, 1879–1963, established in 1934 three functions in his model. 1. Representation, Darstellung, of states of affair. 2. Expression, Ausdruck, of the sender's feelings. 3. Appeal, appel to the receiver. Roman Jakobson, 1896–1982, who belonged to the Prague School and promoted structuralism and functionality, elaborated six functions which are based as well on Malinowski's as on Bühler's model. 1. Referential, denotative, to convey messages or information. 2. Emotive, expressive, to express attitudes, feelings and emotions. 3. Conative, to persuade and influence others through commands and entreaties. 4. Phatic, to establish and maintain social relations. 5. Metalingual, to clear up difficulties about intentions, words and meanings. 6. Poetic, to indulge in language for its own sake.